was a time of conquest and imperialization. Egypt's army, commanded by Pharaoh Merneptah, was making incursions into Africa and the Near East in a coordinated attempt to expand their empire. Their society was what might be considered surprisingly advanced, considering the nomadic nature of the region, and much of what we know about human history from this area is thanks to the documentation of Egyptian history. Around 1220 BCE, or BC for those old school among us, Egypt recorded a vast campaign to defeat and create servants of the various communities in Canaan. Where is Canaan, you might ask? Here's Canaan. It's a pretty broad area, and there are a lot of different communities that lived around this region. One crucial piece of evidence that was discovered was a stone tablet describing the victories of the Egyptians during this period of conquest. It's very interesting what this tablet says.
The princes are prostrate, saying, "Peace." Not one is raising his head among the 9 bows. Now that Libya has come to ruin, Hatti is pacified, the Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome, Gezer has been captured, Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt.
Now, I don't know if you caught it or not, but those words are the earliest recorded documents outside the Bible to name the forebearers of the Jewish faith of Christ's time and ultimately Christianity today. Israel, laid waste. Let's break down why this particular piece of historical evidence is so important. Before Israel was Israel and not the modern day Israel we think of. We'll get to that at some later point. The people of this region were pretty much nomads, living off the land, growing what they needed to survive, and not really venturing too far outside their small communities. They weren't explorers, they weren't interested in resettling, they'd found a land that was comfortable for them and they settled there. These villages, and again, not villages you might think of today, existed pretty much like the rest of the Near Eastern world, isolated, self-sustaining, with only the most basic of skills. It was inevitable. At some point or another, these communities would come in contact and develop a crude diplomatic relationship with one another. Whenever this might have started to happen, we can't necessarily be sure, but Egypt's mention of Israel in its official records shows very clearly that these were no longer individual communities, but a group sharing a particular ideology. One, worshipping the god known as El. The second important thing to point out is that this is another threshold for understanding when the Bible started to come into existence. At the time this document known as the Merneptah Stele was chiseled, Israel communicated through oral history. There was no written language to record their stories. Stories of Israel's history up to this point were passed down from generation to generation, shifting and evolving like a game of telephone. To outsiders like Pharaoh, they were just barbarians to be conquered, but to this community laid waste by Egypt, the history from their side is one of being forced to confront an existential threat together for the first time, banding together under their god El, the same way that Americans rallied around the flag after 9/11. Israel would write down their own history many generations later, but the oral traditions would continue to emerge and proliferate across the land of Canaan. But before we move on, you might be wondering, where did the name for this divine figure come from? A quick Hebrew lesson. This word El, read right to left, translates into God. The Old Testament calls God informally El, and many times you'll see the plural of El, Elohim, which is informal gods, plural. You might also know that Yahweh, many times spelled without the vowels in English, is another name that God goes by. This is the formal name for God, meaning roughly, I am that I am. So in the same way that you'd call Bob a man, you'd call Yahweh El. We'll look into Hebrew and its role in understanding biblical context and interpretation at a later point, but for now, keep in mind that name, El, and that it's one of 2 ways to refer to the same divine creator of ancient Israel, modern-day Judaism, and yes, even Christianity. In the Bible, the Israelites got their name after Jacob wrestled God. And what does Israel translate to? He who wrestles or triumphs over God. So the Israelites literally have that they are a people of God in their name. It all started with El. So who was El? El was one of the many pantheon of gods worshipped by pre-Israelite Canaan religion. There was creator and father god El, his wife Asherah, the storm god Baal, and the goddess of love and war, Anat. You'll notice that some of these figures actually make an appearance in the Bible, as the priests of Baal come up against the god of Yahweh, known as El. Canaanites around this region worship male and female gods, and so it happened that the most prominent god for the region that would later become Judah was the prehistoric El. Even the eternal creator God that we Christians believe in have their roots in the stories even more ancient than ours. And it's pretty amazing to see the whole picture and the journey that's led to where we are now in our faith. But getting back to that threshold moment where El had become the God of Israel, before written history, but after oral traditions had brought them together, Egypt described their state as laid to waste. Oh, no. While they likely pillaged and sacked the crude communities in this particular region of Canaan, they didn't massacre everyone. They left Israel alive but destitute. And this community obviously wouldn't forget Egypt's cruelty as generations wore on, and they actually started writing down their own records. And as we'll see time and time again, Israel does have an unbelievably lucky streak when it comes to surviving. They're actually the only cultures in the region to have done so, and for their tiny, decentralized size, I'd go so far as to say it's a miracle that we have these pieces of history to look at and reflect on. Origins. We're always searching to understand where we came from. We're given this history of a sprouting faith, a faith that would continue to grow and bloom, taking in the world around it so that it might flourish in its full brilliance. This story that our God was just a God amongst gods shouldn't be a challenge to our faith as we see it now, with small pieces of history preserved for us millennia later. We can open our eyes just a little wider to the miracles that have profoundly impacted where we are now. Stories of survival and transformation can be useful to us all. Until our paths cross again, may the peace of a God that surpasses all understanding be with you.